Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 302 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. I have another cartridge comparison for you today, and we are going to talk about the 300 Winchester Magnum and the 7mm precision rifle cartridge. Now, on one hand, I could understand why you'd be thinking, John, these cartridges are pretty different from each other. Why are we comparing them? I hear what you're saying, but bear with me for a minute. Now, no list of big game hunting cartridges is complete without the 300 Winchester Magnum, and it consistently ranks among the most popular calibers used for hunting all manner of medium and big game. That's for a good reason. The 300 Win Mag has developed a sterling reputation afield across the whole spectrum of game in the 60-plus years it has been in use. On the other hand, the brand new 7mm precision rifle cartridge has taken the hunting world by storm since coming on the scene in 2023. I'm not exaggerating when I say I have never seen a cartridge make as big of a splash as the 7 PRC did when it was introduced by Hornady. Even though it's still very new, the 7mm PRC has also quickly developed a great reputation as an accurate and effective big game hunting round. So with those things in mind, it's not surprising that many hunters looking for a new hunting rifle are considering either the 7mm PRC or the 300 Winchester Magnum. Now, both offer certain advantages to hunters, and there is a pretty good amount of overlap in their capabilities, but there are also some important differences between these two cartridges that are also important to keep in mind as well. So in this episode, I discuss the pros and cons of each rifle cartridge, along with recommendations on which one is best suited for various hunting situations, so you can decide which one will work best for your individual needs. Now, please do me a big favor. Hit that subscribe or follow button in your podcast app that you're listening to the show on right now. And if you haven't already done so, please leave me a rating or a review. Doing those things really helps me out, and if you subscribe, you'll also start to receive my new episodes automatically after I release them. Now, next, I've put articles in the show notes for a bunch of gear recommendations to include 7 PRC and 300 Win Mag hunting ammo and hunting rifle recommendations, ear protection recommendations, scopes, slings, all that sort of stuff that I really like and find useful. Click on those links to get more details about all of that stuff. And next, make sure you are on my email list. To do that, click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com and sign up there to get my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges. Not only will you get my ebook when you sign up, plus you'll also start to receive the emails I send out every weekday. These are entertaining and informative messages about hunting, shooting, ballistics, all that sort of stuff. I get feedback all the time from people telling me how much they look forward to hearing from me every day and how much they enjoy receiving those emails. If you like the podcast, you're going to love those emails. So make sure you are getting them too by going to huntingguns101.com and signing up there. Okay, let's get started talking about the 7 PRC and the 300 Win Mag. As usual, we'll start with their history. Now, the years right after World War II were a true renaissance of civilian firearm and cartridge development in the U.S. after the manufacturing base that produced gigantic quantities of weapons for military use during the 1940s transitioned back to firearm and ammunition development for civilians. For instance, that time period saw a flood of new centerfire rifle cartridges like the .223 Remington, .243 Winchester, .280 Remington, and .308 Winchester hit the market. Now, Weatherby fans like to point out that Roy Weatherby released his first handful of Magnum cartridges that bore his name in the 1940s. However, the modern Magnum era really hit its stride when Winchester continued similar development to what Roy Weatherby was doing in the 1950s and 60s when they introduced their own line of belted Magnum cartridges using a modified 375 H&H Magnum case. The heavy-hitting big-bore 4.58 Win Mag came on the scene first, 1956. Then they subsequently released the 3.38 Win Mag and the 2.64 Win Mag during the next couple years. Those three cartridges all utilized a modified 3.75 H&H Magnum case, neck down or up in the case of the 4.58 Win Mag, and shortened from 2.85 inches to 2.5 inches long. Now, designers at Winchester used those shortened cases so all three cartridges would fit in a standard length rifle action, right? Same as a 30-06, instead of requiring a longer Magnum length action, which was the case with the original 375 H&H. Now, while they were far from perfect, the 264 Win Mag, 338 Win Mag, and 458 Win Mag were all pretty commercially successful to one degree or another. Winchester didn't stop there with those three cartridges, though. Now, as good as they were, Winchester really hit things out of the park when they rolled out their 300 Winchester Magnum in 1963. Winchester used a modified 338 Winchester Magnum case neck down to use a 30 caliber bullet. So the 300 Winchester Magnum basically duplicated the performance of the old 300 H&H Magnum, and it could fire a 180 grain bullet at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Now, unlike the H&H 30 caliber Magnum, though, the 300 Win Mag utilized that same shorter case that fit in a standard length rifle action, like the other new Winchester belted Magnums, as well as the also brand new 7mm Remington Magnum that hit the market in 1962. Offering a dramatic improvement over the old 30-06 that also compared favorably to the 7mm Rim Mag in many ways, the 300 Win Mag was an almost instant commercial success for Winchester, and the cartridge remains extremely popular to this day. Now we'll shift gears and focus on today's new hotness, the 7mm precision rifle cartridge from Hornady. Now we need to talk a little about the forerunners of the 7 PRC first, the 6.5 PRC and the 300 PRC. Now those two cartridges were the first two members of the precision rifle cartridge family. Both hit the market around the same time a few years ago. Now those cartridges may not look related at first glance, but both use the 375 Ruger as a parent case. Now, first introduced back in 2007 as the result of a collaboration between Hornady and Ruger, the 375 Ruger was built to deliver the same sort of performance as the legendary 375 H&H Magnum. However, the 375 Ruger does so out of a standard length rifle action instead of requiring a longer Magnum length action like the 375 H&H. So this allowed gun manufacturers to build rifles delivering 375 H&H level performance, which is renowned all over the world, but allowing them to do so using a smaller, handier, and less expensive rifle. Now, a couple of factors allowed the 375 Ruger to achieve those ballistics. First, it has the same .532-inch casehead diameter as the 375 H&H, so both cartridges use a standard Magnum bolt face. However, unlike the 375 H&H, and then cartridges like the 7 Mag and 300 Win Mag descended from it, the 375 Ruger is a beltless cartridge with minimal taper, so the actual body of the 375 Ruger case is larger in diameter than the 375 H&H. This results in a slight increase in case capacity for the 375 Ruger over the 375 H&H, even though the 375 Ruger is a little shorter overall, right? So you just make the case body a little bit fatter, remove some of that taper, and bam, you got a case that, even though it's a little bit shorter, has a little bit more powder capacity than the 375 H&H. So anyway, the 6.5 PRC and the 300 PRC both utilize modified 375 Ruger cases, and they have an overall design that's optimized for performance with long, high BC bullets. Plus, both cartridges also incorporate some modern cartridge design features to improve their overall accuracy potential. Now, the 6.5 PRC is a short-action cartridge that shoots 6.5mm or .264 caliber projectiles, while the 300 PRC is a physically larger cartridge utilizing 30 caliber .308-inch bullets and requires a longer Magnum-length rifle action. Now, both cartridges were well received in the hunting and shooting communities, and many soon began clamoring for a 7 PRC to fill the gap between the 6.5 and the 300. Those people got what they asked for when Hornady received formal SAMI certification for the 7mm PRC in mid-2022, and they officially announced the new cartridge to the world later that year. Now, instead of attempting to push a bullet with a moderately high BC as fast as possible in a long-action rifle, Hornady designed the 7mm PRC to fire heavier bullets with an insanely high ballistic coefficient, right at 3,000 feet per second. For instance, typical 7mm PRC ballistics are a 175 grain bullet, .689 G1BC at 3,000 feet per second, or a 180 grain bullet, 0.796 BC at 2,950 feet per second. Both loads use very long, aerodynamic, heavy for caliber bullets that minimize bullet drop and wind drift at extended range. We'll discuss the details later, but the 7 PRC also utilizes many of the same accuracy-enhancing modern cartridge design principles as the 6.5 Creedmoor, the 6.5 PRC, the 6.8 Western, and the 300 PRC. For instance, the 7 PRC also has ample head height for use with those long, high BC bullets that are becoming more and more popular these days. 7mm precision rifle cartridge rifles also usually have a relatively fast rifling twist rate. SAMI spec is 1 in 8 inches. They need that fast twist rate to stabilize those long, heavy, high BC bullets. The cartridge is also built with a long enough case neck to provide adequate neck tension with those long bullets, which can help with accuracy. They also have a relatively tight, quote-unquote tight, freebore diameter. Now, freebore is the smooth portion of a rifle barrel closest to the cartridge. Having a more quote-unquote snug freebore diameter means there's less room for the bullet to yaw upon firing before engaging the rifling. This can also help enhance accuracy. So long story short, the 7 PRC is an efficient cartridge designed specifically to launch the heaviest and most aerodynamic 7mm bullets at magnum velocities, while at the same time providing a high degree of accuracy potential from off-the-shelf rifles using factory ammunition. So we've talked about the basics of both cartridges and where they came from. Now let's talk about how they compare directly to each other, the 7 PRC versus the 300 Win Mag. We'll start with their external dimensions. Now, both cartridges have the same overall length of 3.34 inches. However, the 7 PRC has a much shorter case and more head height than the 300 Win Mag. Now, head height is the amount of space available for the bullet outside the case while staying within the SAMI specifications for the cartridge. Basically, a cartridge with more head height can use very long, aerodynamic bullets without requiring them to be seated so deeply into the case that they intrude into the powder column, and without having them stick out of the case so far that they exceed the maximum SAMI overall length for the cartridge. Next, both cartridges have a .532-inch rim diameter, and they require a larger Magnum bolt face. The 7 PRC uses a beltless case that is larger in diameter than the non-belted portion of the 300 Win Mag case, .532 inches for the 7 PRC versus .513 inches for the 300 Win Mag. Additionally, the 300 Win Mag has a 25-degree shoulder, while the 7 PRC has a steeper 30-degree shoulder angle. Those factors result in the 7 PRC having more powder capacity than you might expect, but the 300 Win Mags can still hold about 10% more powder than the 7 PRC as a result of its much longer case length. Now, the 7 PRC also has a longer case neck than the 300 Win Mag. We'll discuss the implications of this difference in more detail later on as well. Bullet weight and bullet diameter are two other important differences between these two cartridges. First, the 7 PRC uses .284 caliber bullets, while the 300 Win Mag uses larger diameter .308 caliber bullets. The 7 PRC normally uses bullets in the 150 to 180 grain range, with 160 grain, 175 grain, and 180 grain bullets being the most common. Specifically, the folks at Hornady built the 7 PRC to use high BC 160 grain monometal and 175 and 180 grain lead core bullets from the beginning. On the other hand, the 300 Win Mag typically uses bullets in factory loads in the 150 to 200 grain range. 150, 165, 168, 180, 190, and 200 grain loads are most common for this cartridge. And once again, we'll discuss the impacts of these differences in bullet diameter and bullet weight in more detail later. And finally, the 7mm PRC is loaded to a slightly higher SAMI maximum average pressure of 65,000 psi versus 64,000 psi for the 300 Win Mag. Now, the differences in external dimensions of the cartridges translate into some interesting differences in their ballistic performance. Now, fortunately, both cartridges are available in multiple different factory loads to assist in conducting an apples-to-apples comparison. This is illustrated when you compare Federal Terminal Ascent, Hornady Outfitter, and Hornady Precision Hunter factory loads for both cartridges. The 7 PRC loads use 160 grain CX, .596 BC, 170 grain terminal ascent, 0.646 BC, and 175 grain ELDX bullets, 0.689 BC. The 300 Win Mag loads use 180 grain CX, 0.469 BC, 200 grain terminal ascent, 0.608 BC, 178 grain ELDX, 0.552 BC, and 200 grain ELDX, 0.597 BC bullets. Now, yes, the Hornady Precision Hunter line has 300 Win Mag loads using both 178 grain and 200 grain ELDX bullets. I included both loads in this comparison. Now note the CX is a lead-free monolithic projectile designed by Hornady to deliver high weight retention and deep penetration. However, as a monolithic projectile, those bullets don't have nearly as high of a BC as the ELDX or the terminal ascent projectiles. Now the ELDX and terminal ascent are designed to expand at velocities as low as about 1,350 to 1,400 feet per second, but the CX requires a faster impact velocity of at least 2,000 feet per second for optimal terminal performance. I also want to point out the various bullets used in these loads for the 7PRC all have a higher ballistic coefficient than those used in comparable 300 Win Mag loads. Finally, a word on velocities. I have a Christensen Arms Ridgeline with a 22-inch barrel. I'm getting about 2,950 feet per second with both of the Hornady factory loads. And the Federal terminal ascent velocities were almost right on the money with their advertised velocity of 2,950 feet per second. But once again, that's in a 22-inch barrel. Bump it up to a 24-inch barrel, might be going even a little bit faster. Now, I went to the range the other day and I checked again just to be sure with everything and verified that my rifle was indeed delivering an average velocity of, like I said, right around 2,950 feet per second for both the 175 grain ELDX and the 160 grain CX. All were double verified with a lab radar and the new Garmin Zero chronograph. I cannot speak to the results anybody else may obtain, but the results I'm seeing with my own eyes out of a 22-inch barrel make me inclined to believe that 3,000 feet per second for both of these Hornady loads is reasonable if you're using a 24-inch barrel. That is what Hornady advertised, and that is also the barrel length that they use for that velocity that they advertise. So take all that for what you will. Okay, moving on. When comparing all 7 of these loads, the 3 7mm PRC loads are actually the flattest shooting of the bunch. Though that 178 grain ELDX for the 300 Win Mag comes close, it still has about 1.5 inches more bullet drop than the 170 grain terminal ascent load, about 2 inches more drop than the 160 grain CX load, and about 3.4 inches more bullet drop than the 175 grain ELDX at 500 yards. This is due to the fact that all 3 7PRC loads have a higher muzzle velocity than the comparable 300 Win Mag loads and shoot bullets with an even higher BC. Heck, with the exception of the 170 grain terminal ascent load for the 7PRC, which is going just 10 feet per second slower than the 178 and 180 grain 300 Win Mag loads, every 7mm PRC load is faster than every 300 Win Mag load. Now, when you compare each comparable load to each other, right, the CX to the CX, the terminal ascent to the terminal ascent, the difference is bigger, but pretty consistent, but also not gigantic, right? We're talking about 150 feet per second difference here. But all 7 of these loadings, but especially the 7PRC loads, are relatively flat shooting. Just 6.8 inches separates the flattest shooting 7PRC load from the most arcing 300 Win Mag load at 500 yards. Now, on the other hand, the 300 Win Mag loadings generally have more muzzle energy than the comparable 7PRC loads. Now, the most powerful 7PRC load in the 175 grain ELDX has about 34 foot-pounds, or about 1% more muzzle energy than the least powerful 300 Win Mag loading, which is the 178 grain ELDX. Now, the situation changes as we go down range, though. The higher BC 7PRC loads start to overtake their comparable 300 Win Mag loads in terms of kinetic energy. Now, things are something of a mixed bag at 500 yards. The 175 grain ELDX for the 7PRC does have the most retained energy of the group. The 200 grain ELDX load for the 300 Win Mag is still number 2 overall, though. And it kind of varies for the other ones. The 160 grain CX load has surpassed the 180 grain CX load, and the 170 grain terminal ascent has nearly caught the 200 grain terminal ascent, but that 300 Win Mag load still has a little bit more retained energy. All things considered, both cartridges are still performing great here. every single load for both cartridges carries over 1,600 foot-pounds of kinetic energy out past 500 yards, and over 1,800 foot-pounds in the case of everything but the 180 CX for the 300 Win Mag, and the 175 and 200 grain ELDX loads still have over 2,000 foot-pounds of energy remaining. Here's how each 7 PRC load compares individually to the comparable 300 Win Mag load in terms of muzzle energy, retained energy at 500 yards, and bullet drop at 500 yards. Federal Terminal Ascent. 300 Win Mag has about 6.7% more muzzle energy, about 1.8% more retained energy at 500 yards, about 4.9 inches more bullet drop at 500 yards, about 13.5% more bullet drop at 500 yards. Hornady Outfitter. 300 Win Mag, 9.5% more muzzle energy. The 7 PRC has about 8.5% more kinetic energy at 500 yards, and the 7 PRC overtakes the 300 Win Mag here just shy of 300 yards. And the 300 Win Mag has about 4.3 inches, or about 12% more bullet drop at 500 yards. Hornady Precision Hunter. The 178 and 200 grain 300 Win Mag loads have about 1% less and about 3% more muzzle energy, respectively, than the 7 PRC here. But the 7 PRC has about 6.5% more kinetic energy than the 200 grain ELDX and about 15.5% more retained energy than the 178 ELDX at 500 yards, right? The 7 PRC starts off with more than the 178 ELDX, overtakes the 200 grain ELDX just shy of 200 yards. And the 178 grain and 200 grain 300 Win Mag loads have 3.4 inches, about 10%, and about 5.7 inches, or about 17% more bullet drop at 500 yards, respectively, than the 7 PRC. Big takeaways. 7 PRC, generally a flatter shooting cartridge that often retains more kinetic energy at longer range, but the 300 Win Mag is harder hitting up close, still holds its own pretty well as ranges increase. Those trends continue as we look out to even longer ranges. Now note, I'm not advocating using either one for hunting at extreme range, but the differences between these cartridges become even more apparent as the range increases. Now the 7 PRC has the flattest trajectory of the bunch. Every 7 PRC load has less bullet drop at 1,000 yards than every 300 Win Mag loads. All the 7 PRC loadings have more kinetic energy than the comparable 300 Win Mag loads in terms of retained kinetic energy here as well at 1,000 yards. The Outfitter and Precision Hunter loads for the 7 PRC accomplish this feat by 200 to 300 yards, and the 7 PRC Terminal Ascent loading passes the 300 Win Mag loading just shy of 700 yards. Indeed, the number 1 and number 2 loads in this comparison in terms of retained energy are the 175 grain ELDX and the 170 grain Terminal Ascent loads for the 7 PRC. The 170 grain Terminal Ascent pulls ahead of the 200 grain ELDX in this area around 800 yards. And yes, we'll talk more later about the difference in bullet construction between the Terminal Ascent and the ELDX, but just realize here that that's a really good high BC offering that's also a well-constructed bullet. And like I said, number 2 in the retained energy department by about 800 yards. Now, 200 grain ELDX, number 3, 200 grain Terminal Ascent, number 4, 160 grain CX, number 5, 178 ELDX, number 6, 180 grain CX is number 7 in terms of retained energy. Now, the 175 grain ELDX loading for the 7mm PRC has about 18 to 20% more kinetic energy remaining at 1,000 yards than both 200 grain loadings for the 300 Win Mag. Now, even that lower BC 170 grain Terminal Ascent has 2.5 to 3.5% more retained energy than the 200 grain 300 Win Mag loads. Once again, this is because those 7mm PRC bullets have the 2 highest BCs of all the bullets used in this comparison, which results in them retaining energy and velocity better than everything else. Even that 160 grain CX loading for the 7 PRC still carries over 1,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy past 500 yards, over 1,000 foot-pounds of energy past 900 yards, and does not dip below its minimum recommended impact velocity until nearly 700 yards. That is a substantial improvement over the 180 grain CX loading for the 300 Win Mag. For reference, that 300 Win Mag 180 grain CX bullet dips below 2,000 feet per second, which is its minimum recommended impact velocity, just past 500 yards. All right, now let's talk about another important factor, wind. So when you compare all these same loads with a full value 10 mile an hour crosswind, the same general trends hold true here, but this is where the 7 PRC really starts to stand apart from the 300 Win Mag. Now, the 7 PRC ELDX has the least wind deflection, followed by the 170 Terminal Ascent. In descending order, going through the rest of the cartridges, we have the 160 grain CX, both 200 grain 300 Win Mag loads, the 178 grain ELDX for the 300 Win Mag, and then finally the 180 CX. While all of these loads, but to a lesser extent with the 180 grain CX, have great wind bucking characteristics, I was especially impressed with how well the 7mm PRC performed here, and all three loads for that cartridge had better performance in the wind than all the 300 Win Mag loads. I would even go so far as to say that having approximately 1 foot of wind deflection at 500 yards with a 10 mile an hour full value crosswind, like the 175 ELDX and 170 terminal ascent, is absolutely outstanding. Indeed, that 175 grain ELDX loading for the 7PRC delivers some of the best performance in windy conditions currently available for any big game hunting ammo right now. Now, the 200 grain loadings for the 300 Win Mag have the same amount of wind deflection, and they both have 3.1 inches more wind deflection than the 175 grain ELDX. That's about a 26% advantage in favor of the 7mm PRC. Now, the 170 grain terminal ascent doesn't perform quite on the level of the 175 grain ELDX here, but it still has a 15% advantage over the two best performing 300 Win Mag loads in this area. And of course, these differences become even more apparent at longer range too, and the advantage for the 7PRC continues to grow. This is an area where the 7PRC really shines with a combination of high muzzle velocity and a very high BC bullet in the 175 grain ELDX, to a lesser extent, but still really good with the 170 grain terminal ascent. Indeed, it performs a lot better than most comparable loadings at extended range, and a hunter or shooter looking for that little bit of an advantage would be well served to look at either the terminal ascent or ELDX loading for the 7mm PRC here. Why is this the case? Assuming the same wind conditions, wind deflection is dependent on bullet velocity and ballistic coefficient. But small changes in ballistic coefficient result in bigger changes in wind deflection than is the case with velocity. So for this reason, the 7mm PRC load firing the super high BC 175 grain ELDX at a faster velocity here comes out on top, with that 170 terminal ascent close second. I wouldn't say the 300 Win Mag does poorly here. It still holds its own, but 30 caliber cartridges in general tend to lag behind 7mm cartridges in this area because the latter are better suited for use with extremely high BC bullets in the weight range that we're normally talking about with these cartridges. Case in point, even the highest BC 300 Win Mag 200 grain ELDX and 200 grain terminal ascent loads still fall short of the 160 grain CX load for the 7mm PRC, which is a lead-free bullet. So you have a real high BC lead-free bullet in the 160 CX that's still edging out two very high BC lead core bullets for the 300 Win Mag here. And in this day of modern rangefinders and ballistic apps and all of that stuff, calculating a bullet holdover, that is to say, dealing with bullet drop at extended range, is less complicated than it used to be. And it is now considerably less difficult to do that, especially you combine that with, say, easily diable elevation turret on your scope. It's easier to do that than it is to calculate for wind. Estimating wind direction and wind velocity is very, very difficult. There's no tried and true way to get it exactly right every time. There's a little bit of art and science involved in it there, and some people are just better at it than others. So this is an area where if you have a really high BC bullet here, like we're talking about for the 7PRC, that resists wind deflection really well, if you make a small error in estimating your wind angle or your wind velocity, that 7PRC loading will be more forgiving of a mistake that you make with your wind call and your wind hold, and you will be off by a smaller amount. And especially as range increases, that could be the difference between a hit or a miss, or a hit on the edge of the vitals versus a hit that misses the vitals entirely, that sort of thing. So this is a big advantage that's hard to overstate. All right, now let's talk about recoil. When you compare the recoil produced by hand loads, very similar to the 175 and 200 grain loads for the 7PRC and the 300 Win Mag, you'll see that both cartridges have fairly stout recoil, but the 300 Win Mag has quite a bit more recoil than the 7PRC. Now, even though it has a slightly lower muzzle velocity, that 300 Win Mag load fires a heavier bullet and uses more powder to achieve that performance. For this reason, the 300 Win Mag has about 16% more free recoil energy than the 7 PRC in this particular case. I wouldn't say either cartridge has a tremendous amount of recoil. I've shot and hunted with both the 7 PRC and the 300 Win Mag pretty extensively. Recoil produced by these loads is on the stout side, but neither is especially painful or difficult to shoot. And yes, my experience at a field and at the range more or less matches those figures I just mentioned. The 7 PRC has quite a bit less recoil than typical 300 Win Mag loads. And interestingly, my 7 PRC is a couple pounds lighter than my 300 Win Mag. And so even though it's a lighter rifle, it still recoils a little bit less. Now, though it does indeed have less recoil, I feel like both the 7 PRC and the 300 Win Mag, but especially the 7 PRC here, are cartridges that have the sort of recoil many people can handle without that much trouble, especially if you shoot a rifle that fits you really well, has a good recoil pad, and or is attached with a muzzle brake or a suppressor. But you just got to remember, the 7 PRC does kick quite a bit less than the 300 Win Mag. There are a couple of other factors worth discussing too. So first, the 300 Win Mag uses larger diameter bullets than the 7 PRC. So specifically, the larger diameter .308 caliber bullets used by this 30 caliber cartridge have about 18% more frontal surface area than the .284 caliber bullets used by the 7 PRC. All other things being equal, a bigger bullet will make a bigger hole, cause more tissue damage, and result in more blood loss. That's a significant advantage in favor of the 300 Win Mag, and those larger diameter bullets can certainly also be helpful when hunting bigger game. Now, on the other hand, and as we covered earlier, many of those longer, heavy for caliber 284-inch or 7mm bullets the 7 PRC uses have a higher ballistic coefficient than the most common .308 caliber bullets used in the 300 Win Mag, especially when bullet weights are similar. Now, like I mentioned earlier, that was the case with every single bullet used in this comparison. The 160 CX had a higher BC than the 180 CX. The 175 grain ELDX had a higher BC than the 178 and even the 200 grain ELDX. Same with the 170 terminal ascent versus the 200 grain terminal ascent. Now, that is generally the case. There are exceptions, though. For instance, Remington's Premier long-range line of ammo is an example. You got 175 grain spear impact, .549 BC for the 7 PRC, and a 190 grain spear impact, .596 BC for the 300 Win Mag. So realize that this is usually an advantage for the 7 PRC, but the details matter, and you got to look at the specifics of each load you're talking about here. Now, those differences are indeed small in favor of the 7 PRC. But it's still worth considering because those slightly more aerodynamic projectiles don't slow down as fast and they're more resistant to wind drift. And I just discussed the details of why I think having a cartridge that resists wind deflection really well is more important than a flatter shooting cartridge that may not resist wind deflection so well. Now next, the 7 PRC also often has an advantage over the 300 Win Mag in terms of bullet sectional density in most cases. Now, sectional density, that's a measure of the ratio of the diameter of a projectile to its mass. All other things equal, a heavier projectile of a given caliber will be longer and therefore have a higher sectional density and consequently probably penetrate deeper than projectiles of a lower sectional mass and lower sectional density. So for instance, 150, 168, 180, 190, and 200 grain .308 caliber bullets have sectional densities of .226, .253, .271, .286, and .301 respectively. At the same time, 160, 170, 175 grain .284 caliber bullets have sectional densities of .283, .301, and .310. So the heaviest 300 Win Mag loads will have a small edge over the lighter 7 PRC bullets, but the 7 PRC generally uses higher sectional density bullets, especially when you're doing apples to apples here. But we need to discuss the elephant in the room here, though. Its higher sectional density notwithstanding, the ELDX is a controversial bullet to say the least. Some hunters love it, others hate it and claim it is just a quote-unquote match bullet with a different package and has no business being used for hunting. That bullet has some undeniable advantages in terms of BC, accuracy potential, and terminal performance at extended range. But I also agree that the ELDX is a very soft bullet. Candidly, it is a little too soft, in my opinion, for use at closer range, especially on bigger game. Can you cleanly kill game with it? Of course. Is it my favorite bullet to use in a situation where I might get a really close range shot, especially on a big animal like an elk or something like that? It's one thing to shoot an elk at 4, 5, 6, 700 yards, something else shooting it at 40, 50, 60, 70 yards. So no, I don't like it in a situation where I might need to use it up close. I really like that terminal ascent bullet though, and I think it is a great hunting bullet that delivers outstanding performance at extended range without sacrificing short range performance either. Fortunately, that bullet is available in both the 7PRC and the 300 Win Mag in factory ammo. Now, the terminal ascent is generally a tougher bullet than the ELDX because it has a bonded core and a solid rear shank. The ELDX does not have either of those characteristics. Comparing apples to apples here, the 200 grain 30 caliber and 7mm 170 grain terminal ascent bullets have the same sectional density 0.301. But that heavier 200 grain terminal ascent bullet has more momentum than the 170 grain terminal ascent, and it will likely penetrate a little better at all typical hunting ranges. On the other hand, go back and look at those ballistic charts, and you'll see that while it lags a little behind the 175 grain ELDX on paper, the 170 grain terminal ascent also delivers wonderful performance across the board. Flatter trajectory, similar retained energy, and more retained energy than that 300 Win Mag loading past 700 yards, better performance in windy conditions, and less recoil than the 200 grain terminal ascent for the 300 Win Mag. I'd still say the 300 Win Mag is generally a heavier hitter for most people most of the time, especially at closer range, and I would not think anyone was making a mistake by hunting with one. But I will say the 7PRC punches well above its weight in terms of terminal performance, while at the same time offering some undeniable advantages in trajectory, wind deflection, and recoil that can all assist the shooter in shot placement to one degree or another. This brings me to my next point. What about the accuracy of these two cartridges? John Snow wrote a fantastic article on this subject for Outdoor Life, but long story short, companies designing new cartridges these days typically employ some more modern cartridge design principles that incorporate best practices obtained from competition and bench rest shooters to obtain the best possible accuracy. Cartridges designed using these principles use faster twist rates to stabilize heavy high BC bullets. They have cases with a long enough neck to support those longer high BC bullets. They can seat those long high BC bullets to the SAMI maximum specified overall length without intruding into the powder column. They employ minimal body taper. They headspace off sharp shoulders, and they have a chamber design with a snug throat. Taken together, these design principles result in cartridges with a very high degree of accuracy potential, especially at extended range. Like I mentioned earlier, the 7PRC incorporates all of those principles. Let's drill down into things in more detail. First, like I mentioned earlier, the throat is the smooth portion of a rifle barrel closest to the cartridge. Having a more snug throat diameter means there's less room for the bullet to yaw upon firing before engaging the rifling. This can help enhance accuracy. Well, the 7PRC has a throat diameter of just 0.0006 inches larger than the bullet diameter. That is a very snug throat diameter compared to other cartridges like the 243 Winchester, 0.0033 inches, or the 30-06, 0.0026 inches. What about the 300 Win Mag? Well, that cartridge has a 0.007 inch throat diameter. That is over 11 times as much quote-unquote slop around the bullet than is the case with the 7PRC. Remember, its throat diameter is just 0.0006 inches larger than the bullet diameter. Additionally, the 7PRC utilizes a case with less body taper and a steeper 30-degree shoulder. Both of these characteristics result in better cartridge alignment in the chamber and more consistent head spacing. It also has a faster SAMI spec twist rate, 1 and 8 inches versus 1 and 10 inches for the 300 Win Mag. Also has more head height and has a longer case neck. All of those things facilitate use with those long, heavy, high BC bullets I keep talking about. Taken together, all of these individual factors also result in excellent accuracy potential for the 7PRC. Which one is better? Both are capable of great accuracy. I have to give the advantage to the 7PRC here. It pains me to say that because I have shot the 300 Win Mag a lot over the years. Really, I think it's still my favorite cartridge. I've killed a lot of game with it. I've shot a lot at the range with it. And I have done so with some pretty accurate rifles. I have a lot of affinity for that cartridge. Even so, I will say, on average, the 7mm PRC has better accuracy potential with factory rifles and with factory ammunition. Yes, details vary on the exact rifle, the exact ammo, the shooter in question, all of that stuff. And yes, I admit there will be occasional instances of 300 Win Mag rifles shooting better than 7 PRC rifles. And yes, users can work around many of these problems with custom 300 Win Mag rifles, magazines, and hand loads designed to accommodate higher BC bullets. And also, like I said, you get a custom hand load for it, a custom chamber, all that sort of thing. You can build a great, super accurate 300 Win Mag rifle that can shoot super high BC bullets really fast and do even better than the 300 Win Mag does with these factory loads I used in this comparison. Or you can skip all that hassle and just get a factory 7mm PRC rifle or a 300 PRC rifle if you want one that's in 30 cal. But I still think the 7 PRC has probably some of the best potential for accuracy available today using factory rifles and factory ammunition. So where do we stand overall? The 7mm PRC fires smaller diameter bullets that usually have a higher BC and a faster velocity than the 300 Win Mag. The 300 Win Mag typically has more recoil and more kinetic energy up close, but the 7 PRC has a flatter trajectory, better resistance to wind deflection, and more kinetic energy at extended range. Now let's talk about ammo availability for these two cartridges. Of the two, the 300 Win Mag is still easily the most popular and widely available. In fact, the 300 Win Mag usually ranks among the top 10 best-selling rifle cartridges in the USA each year. For example, Midway USA currently lists 76 300 Win Mag loads, but only 6 7 PRC loads as I record this. Pretty much every ammunition manufacturer of note like Barnes, Berger, Black Hill, Browning, Federal, Hornady, HSM, Nosler, Norma, PPU, Remington, Sierra, Sellar & Ballot, Swift, and Winchester, just to name a few, produce a wide variety of ammo for the 300 Win Mag. And since it uses 308 cal bullets, virtually every major style of hunting bullet is available. Winchester PowerPoint, Federal Trophy Copper, Remington Core-Locked, Barnes TTSX, Hornady CX, ELDX, ELD Match, Interlock, Nosler Accubon Long Range, Ballistic Tip, E-Tip, and Partition, Federal Terminal Ascent, Fusion Softpoint, Power Shock Softpoint, etc. On the other hand, the 7 PRC is literally brand new, but has become extremely popular in an astonishingly short period of time. Hornady was the first company to produce factory 7 PRC ammo. They currently offer 3 loads for the cartridge, an offering in their match line with a 180 grain ELD match bullet, an offering in their outfitter line with a 160 grain CX bullet, and an offering in their precision hunter line with the 175 grain ELDX. I think the match ammo is great for use at the range, but I prefer the outfitter and precision hunter 7 PRC loads for hunting. Both are excellent for hunting all manner of game in North America and elsewhere in the world. Federal also recently started making 7 PRC ammo as well in their premium and terminal ascent lines using a 175 grain ELDX, the 155 grain terminal ascent, and now the 170 grain terminal ascent. Remington also recently picked up the cartridge, now offers 7mm PRC factory ammo with a 175 grain Spear impact bullet in their premier long range line. Federal and Remington also announced new 7 PRC ammo offerings at the SHOT Show in their tipped fusion, core lock tip, and cut line, or CUT lines. Nosler also announced a load for it with their 175 grain Accubon long range bullet too. All that stuff came out at the 2024 SHOT Show. 7 PRC ammo prospects are looking great in the near future. There are also rumblings that other companies like Barnes will pick up the cartridge as well. Now, for more info on hunting ammunition recommendations for each cartridge, click the appropriate link in the show notes or in the video description. And I go into a lot of detail on that for both the 300 Win Mag and the 7 PRC in those articles. Now let's talk about rifles. The rifle situation with the 7 PRC and the 300 Win Mag, very similar to the ammo situation. Rifles chambered in 300 Win Mag, by far the most common, but there's also a good and improving selection of 7mm PRC rifles. For example, Sportsman's Warehouse currently lists 71 7mm PRC rifles and a staggering 334 300 Win Mag rifles as I record this. Once again, there you have it. But, like I said, though, things are pretty good with the 7 PRC considering how new it is, and things are also getting better there. Both very easy to find in bolt-action hunting rifles like the Browning X-Bolt, Christensen Arms Ridgeline, Remington 700, Ruger American, Savage 110, stuff like that. Now, the 300 Win Mag is also available in some rifles not manufactured in 7 PRC, at least not right now anyway. You got the Browning lever-action rifle, the Browning automatic rifle, Browning AB3, Tikka T3X, the Howa 1500, Mossberg Patriot, Weatherby Vanguard. But that list of 7 PRC rifles will likely continue to grow as well. Which one is easier to find? Things may be different in 10 years, but the 300 Win Mag has easily the best selection of rifles right now. Now next, remember what I mentioned earlier about the 7 PRC generally having a faster rifling twist rate? That's usually true, not a hard and fast rule though. For instance, Browning produces their Speed LR and Max LR versions of the X-Bolt in 300 Win Mag with a faster 1 and 8 inch twist rate, same as the 7 PRC SAMI standard. So this facilitates the use of even longer and higher BC 30 caliber bullets like the 212 grain ELDX from Hornady. That bullet has a .663 BC. Now it's interesting to see here in the last couple of years, companies like Browning in particular, we may see others getting on board with it as well, but taking older cartridges like the 270 and like the 300 Win Mag and putting a 1 and 8 inch twist rate on it to allow them to use some of those high BC bullets like you saw with the 6.8 Western for the 270 and the 300 PRC for the 300 Win Mag. The 270 and the 300 Win Mag can't shoot those high BC bullets quite as fast as those newer cartridges, but you can still breathe a little bit of extra life into those older legacy cartridges like that with a rifle with the right rifling twist rate. So that's great news there. Now, it is also important to realize that gun manufacturers tend to put longer barrels on rifles, chambered and Magnum cartridges in general. This is because those cartridges need a longer barrel to effectively and efficiently burn that larger powder charge. Now, the 7 PRC actually works pretty well out of shorter barreled rifles, and you can usually find it in rifles with 20, 22, and 24-inch barrels. And like I said, my Christensen Arms Ridgeline that I have has a 22-inch barrel, does great with it. Now, the 300 Win Mag, normally available in rifles with 24 or even 26-inch long barrels. A handful of rifles have shorter 22-inch barrels, but those shorter barrels are somewhat unusual, most common on quote-unquote suppressor-ready models. Now, while both cartridges are available in rifles of the same size and length, it's important to note that the 7 PRC will sometimes have a slight advantage over the 300 Win Mag for those looking for a lighter and or a more compact rifle. Here's an example of what I mean. Browning manufactures their X-Bolt Speed suppressor ready in both cartridges. The variant 7 PRC has a 20-inch long barrel and is 40.75 inches long. The variant in 300 Win Mag has a 22-inch barrel and an overall length of 42.75 inches. Browning also manufactures their new X-Bolt 2 Speed in both cartridges as well. It has a 24-inch long barrel and is 44.75 inches long when chambered in 7 PRC, has a 26-inch long barrel and is 46.75 inches long in 300 Win Mag. So having a shorter and handier rifle is more important on some months than on others, so keep that in mind. And just like the case with ammo, click the links in the show notes or the video description to learn more about other 300 Win Mag and 7mm PRC hunting rifles I like. Like I said, I go into a lot of detail in those blog articles linked in the show notes. So click those to check those out and learn more about that subject. Now, here is a question that I get a lot. Is the 7mm PRC going to last? Or is it the just latest flash in the pan that's going to fade away after a couple years like the 300 SAUM, the 7mm Remington Ultra Magnum, and the 243 Winchester Super Short Magnum? Nobody wants to buy a rifle chambered in a new cartridge only for the manufacturer to discontinue production of rifles and factory ammo just a couple years down the road. Completely understand why someone wouldn't want to use something brand new that is uncommon. But a lot of people have to start using that cartridge for it to become common. So it kind of becomes a cycle there, right? Which one came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it popular, so therefore the companies made lots of ammo and different rifles for it? Or did they make lots of rifles and ammo for it and that helped it become popular? You got to have enough on each end of that equation for them to balance each other out, because you can definitely see a situation where a company makes a ton of rifles that nobody really cares about and buys, and they just sit on shelves for a long time. But on the other hand, too, you could run into a situation where a cartridge is pretty popular. People want to buy rifles and ammo in it, but they have a hard time getting what they're looking for because supply is pretty tight on it, so that can further hamstring demand down the road. Now, the 7 PRC is an interesting situation where it was very popular out of the gate, and Hornady and other companies did a really good job of supporting it right out of the gate. A lot of rifle choices. Hornady was the only ammo manufacturer for a little while, but Federal picked it up quickly. And like I said, now we got Nosler on board, and the same thing with Remington. We're probably going to see Barnes jump on board as well here too. So things have picked up quickly for this cartridge. It's impossible for me to know for sure, but based on what I just told you and kind of what I'm thinking, looking into my crystal ball, but I would not be surprised at all if the 7PRC sticks around for the long term. In fact, I would pick the 7mm PRC out of all the new cartridges to hit the market in the last 5 years, maybe even last 10 years, if I had to choose one of them most likely to have the best long-term success. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's really hard for me to bet against Hornady's design and marketing teams. Plus, the company, like I also said, did a really good job of getting a large number of other manufacturers to pick up the cartridge right out of the gate. I'm not exaggerating when I say I've never seen anything explode in popularity quite like the 7PRC did. Get back with me in 10 years and we'll see how accurate my prediction was, but like I said, I think this one's going to be around for the long term. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about how each cartridge performs in a couple different hunting situations. So, do you primarily hunt medium-sized game like whitetail deer, pronghorn, feral hogs, or black bear at ranges within 200 yards? Both are extremely effective deer hunting cartridges. They'll absolutely get the job done on medium-sized game if you do your part. There isn't a significant difference between the 300 Win Mag and 7PRC on deer-sized game inside 200 yards. Both are more than powerful enough for that sort of work. I've used both of them pretty extensively in this role. I took a pronghorn at about 150 yards with a 165 TTSX from my 300 Win Mag. That buck dropped in its tracks. I also shot an impala, that's about the size of a deer, with a 7PRC at about 60 yards with a 160 grain CX. That buck staggered at the shot. It only ran about 10 yards afterwards. So both are wonderful here. If you're going to be hunting in thick brush or in the tight confines of a deer stand, remember what I just mentioned about barrel length a minute ago. The couple extra inches in overall length of a rifle can be a headache to deal with when you're trying to quickly and quietly maneuver for a shot. I wouldn't say either is a really good choice or a really bad choice here, but out of the two, a 7PRC rifle with a 20 or 22 inch barrel will definitely be easier to handle than a 300 Win Mag rifle, especially if that rifle has a 26 inch barrel. And at the same time, the 7PRC will also be a little bit lighter on your shoulder. What if you're looking for the cartridge better suited for longer range hunting for game like mule deer or pronghorn in open country where you might need to take a shot at several hundred yards? Once again, they'll both work really well in this role. Situations like these are where they start to stand apart from the others. I think the 300 Win Mag is great in this role, but the 7PRC definitely has the advantage as the range increases in terms of having less recoil, flatter trajectory, and especially better performance in the wind. And also, depending on the load, it also carries more energy out to extended range too. I shot a mule deer buck at about 330 yards with my 7PRC on a hunt in New Mexico in 2023. I could have made that shot also very easily with my 300 Win Mag, but he dropped right in his tracks there with the 7PRC. It was a wonderful choice for the job. It did the job really well, and I had a lot of confidence in that whole rifle scope ammo setup that I had there, and it was a piece of cake making it. And like I said earlier, as much as I like my 300 Win Mag, I'm not a super long range guy. I'm not going to take shots out at what most people would consider to be a ridiculous range. Without going into detail, I have a limit that I will shoot game at with both my 300 Win Mag and with my 7mm PRC. That limit is a little bit farther out there. The furthest I'll take a shot with the 7PRC than is the case with the 300 Win Mag. That's all I'll say about that. And that's all well and good, though. What about bigger game? Do you want a hunting cartridge well suited for use on larger animals? Caribou, moose, elk, eland, kudu, red stag, all that sort of stuff. Both are going to work extremely well when used on bigger game in North America, Africa, Europe, elsewhere. Now, to be perfectly candid, most hunters don't need the extreme long-range capabilities of the 7PRC, and something like a 300 Win Mag or a 7 Win Mag will work great for the vast majority of elk hunting situations for most people. But one, the 7PRC is a better choice than the 300 Win Mag here for those that do have the ability and the confidence and the desire to shoot at a little bit longer range, regardless of what the rest of us may feel about that. If you're going to take that shot, I think the 7PRC is the better choice of these two cartridges for those that are going to do that. Additionally, you have that whole deal, besides just the external ballistics of the cartridge, you have the fact that this cartridge gives you an advantage on average with factory rifles, factory ammo in terms of accuracy. That's hard to quantify. We all want to do our best to put that bullet in the right spot on the animal to deliver a clean, quick, ethical kill on it. The overall accuracy potential of the 7mm PRC is definitely better than the 300 Win Mag. Once again, on average, factory rifles, factory ammo. That becomes even more important as the range increases. It's also very important on bigger game. I'm not at all trying to throw shade on the 300 Win Mag here. Like I said, I love this cartridge dearly. It's absolutely one of my all-time favorite cartridges. I also used it to kill my first elk. I shot an elk at about 40 yards with my 300 Win Mag using a Federal 180 grain trophy copper load. It only ran about 50 yards afterwards, too. I could not have asked for much better performance. Though the situation fell within the window where the 300 Win Mag generally outperforms the 7mm PRC at a real close range like that, but that newer 7 PRC still would have done great on that elk under those exact conditions with the right bullet. Shoot that same elk in the same spot with a 160 grain CX, it probably would have run just as far as it did with that 180 grain trophy copper. In that vein, I took a blue wildebeest, which, though not as big as an elk, is considered one of the toughest species of African plains game, with a 160 grain CX from my 7 PRC at about 90 yards. He dropped in his tracks after the shot, too. And a 300 Win Mag would have worked great on the same wildebeest under those same conditions as well. But like I mentioned earlier, a person with the right shooting skills who wanted to extend their effective range by another couple hundred yards would be well served by a 7 PRC. In addition to the fact that the higher BC 7 PRC offerings retain more energy at extended range, the 7 PRC has better resistance to wind deflection across the board. And since windy conditions tend to be pretty common out west, wind resistance for a cartridge should not be overlooked or understated. I wouldn't blame someone for choosing a 300 Win Mag. Right now, though, I personally lean towards the 7 PRC here, and I think it is a good choice for someone who wants a capable, all-around hunting rifle for everything from deer up to elk and moose under a variety of conditions. With the right bullet, the thing is going to be darn effective at 50 yards, and it's going to be darn effective at 850 yards. For instance, I had a friend take a big bull elk up in Colorado at 800 plus yards with a single shot from a 7 PRC using that 175 grain ELDX. The bull ran just 40 feet after the hit. Now, unfortunately, he shot that elk in the evening and didn't get a great trophy photo of the elk in the field. But if you're looking at the photo of the elk on Instagram or on YouTube, it's the elk on the left in the photo. The deer and the other elk were taken with a 7 Rim Mag at much closer range. Now, are you looking for a great cartridge for sheep, mountain goat, or tahr hunting where you need an effective cartridge that is available in a lightweight and easy to carry rifle, but still has manageable recoil? 300 Win Mag will certainly work, but I would prefer the 7 PRC here because it is available in shorter, lighter, easier to carry rifles, and it still also won't have terrible recoil. My Christensen Arms Ridgeline FFT be a great choice here, and if you wanted to go even lighter, the Ridgeline FFT Titanium would be even better. Flatter trajectory and better resistance to wind deflection also really come in handy here. And they're going to help a hunter potentially battle challenging environmental conditions to place his or her shot appropriately. Now, are you specifically hunting big, dangerous game like brown or grizzly bear? What if you hunt in Alaska or Canada and you need a heavy-hitting cartridge just in case you find yourself on the wrong end of a grizzly or a brown bear attack? Yes, you can cleanly kill the big bears with either cartridge. Numerous people have done exactly that over the years. I mean, a 30-06 felled the current Boone and Crockett record book brown bear back in 1952. Of these two cartridges, I would much prefer a 300 Win Mag with premium 180 or 200 grain bullets, like a 180 grain Barnes TTSX or a 180 or 200 grain Nosler Partition, if encounters with bigger bears are a possibility. But to be perfectly candid, I do not recommend either cartridge for actually hunting the big bears. Same is true for other species of dangerous game like Cape buffalo. I would prefer to carry something like a 338 Win Mag, a 375 H&H, or a 375 Ruger in grizzly country. Now, what if you're sensitive to recoil and you need a lower recoiling cartridge? Both have stout recoil, but the 7 PRC is definitely the better choice for a lower recoiling option here. Now, I've said it a bunch of times. The 300 Win Mag and the 7 PRC are both excellent rifle cartridges. It is tough to pick a clear winner between them. The differences between them are significant in some respects, but there's also a lot of overlap in the situations they're best suited for. Really, both are suitable for many diverse hunting tasks, ranging from hunting plains game in Africa and deer in the southern hemisphere to the whole spectrum of North American game. Both will work well for a lot of situations, but you need to carefully analyze your potential needs before making a decision. In the end, a lot of this comes down to personal preference, the exact game you're after, and the conditions of your hunt. So analyze all of that stuff and choose the one you feel most comfortable with, and it will probably serve you well afield. Now, as usual, I've written a detailed article about these two cartridges for the Big Game Hunting blog. There is a link to that article in the show notes if you want to check it out. And like I mentioned too, there are links to those articles I wrote about 7 PRC and 300 Win Mag ammo and hunting rifles, and recommendations for other stuff like slings, scopes, ear protection, all of that stuff. So check out that stuff in the show notes if you want to read more about any of that stuff. As we wrap up, please do me a big favor, hit that subscribe or follow button, whatever podcast app you're using, and please leave me a rating and or a review for the show as well. Doing both of those things really helps me out. And finally, click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com. Sign up there to get my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges and to join my email list. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.